Welcome back to Adventures in History. I'm your host Danny, and every week we uncover incredible true stories from the past, from spectacular inventions and daring explorers to world-changing ideas and unforgettable characters. We leave the dark chapters behind, and we focus on the fun, surprising, and inspiring moments that everyone can enjoy. And whether you're listening on your own or you've got some kids in the background, there's always a new adventure to be discovered. So sit back, get curious, and let's travel back in time. Alright, here's a strange question for you. Imagine you're putting together a show and you're making one of the biggest bets of your entire life. And you're making that bet just on a sound. I'll explain in a second. It's not a product, it's not a huge building or some sort of construction. It's just a sound, specifically a singer's voice. And it's a voice that you personally have never actually heard with your own ears. And to make this bet, you agree to pay more money per night than almost any other performer in the world had ever been paid. And that's before you've even confirmed that this person can actually sing. And that's a real decision made by a real man in the year of 1850. And you might know this man as someone who had actually invented the circus. But there's so much more to the story that we absolutely must talk about. And this bet he made, by the way, well, it's either going to make him an absolute fortune or completely wipe him out, or maybe both. So stick around, because we are going to find out exactly how that bet played out a little bit later on. But first, we gotta rewind, and we gotta meet the man who made it. A man who was already thinking of ways to make money before he could even drive a wagon by himself. Welcome to Adventures in History. Let's get into the first part of the story. Our story starts in Bethel, Connecticut in 1810, and a boy by the name of Phineas Taylor Barnum. You might know him today as P.T. Barnum. And he grows up in a family that doesn't have a lot of extra money. And here's a fun detail I want to start out with. His grandfather, who was actually known around town as Uncle Finn, was pretty famous for being a total practical joker. I mean, the man really loved a good prank. And that sense of humor clearly rubbed off because young P.T. Barnum, well, he grows up to become maybe the biggest prankster in American history, just on a way larger national scale. In fact, by age 12, Barnum was already selling homemade cherry rum to soldiers. And he had saved up enough money to actually buy his own livestock, like chickens and cows. And by the time he was in his early 20s, he actually owns a general store, where he's selling general goods. He runs a lottery business, which I think probably was not legal at the time. And he had started his own very newspaper, and that's going to become really important because that newspaper is going to get him into some trouble later on. Because he uses it to publish some pretty bold opinions about local church leaders in his town that were getting pretty heavy into politics. And those opinions that he published, well, those led to lawsuits. And one day a couple of lawyers knock on his door, and Barnum actually ends up spending 2 months in jail just over some opinions that he had, which, if you think about it, is a pretty strange way to start out a career. You're selling homemade alcohol as a preteen. You're getting locked up as a young adult for just basically saying too much in your newspaper. It's not exactly the resume you'd expect from someone who was about to become one of the most famous entertainers in American history. Now, in 1835, Barnum made his very first move into show business. We're going to fast forward. And we're going to fast forward just a couple of years to 1841, because that's the moment that Barnum truly finds his groove. And that's when Barnum takes over a rundown old museum in the middle of New York City. And what he does with that museum is going to blow your mind. Let's over to part 2. Alright, so Barnum buys an old museum on a street called Broadway, which is in a town called Manhattan, inside of New York City. And he decides, I want everybody to know who I am. So he slaps his own name on it in huge letter. And it says, Barnum's American Museum. And he didn't just quietly reopen this museum. I mean, in very Barnum style, he put a giant lighthouse lamp on the roof so that people could see it glowing from blocks away. And he paints enormous pictures of exotic animals right in between the windows. In fact, he even put a garden on the roof where visitors could take, you ready for this? Visitors could take hot air balloon rides right off the roof. I mean, that's how Barnum operated. And this museum that he's built, this place, becomes the single most popular attraction in New York City for like 2 decades straight. But here's the exhibit that really put Barnum on the map. And that happened in 1842. And that is when visitors would walk up to a glass case, and inside of it was something that should not have existed. It was some sort of creature with scales, fins, and a face that looked eerily human. The newspapers were calling it a mermaid, but was it? Was it real? We're going to come back to that in just a second. Here's the thing about Barnum you should know though. He had a whole philosophy about hoaxes. And he goes like this. He said, I don't believe in duping the public, but I believe in first attracting and then pleasing them. In other words, you got to get people in the door with something amazing, something jaw-dropping, something maybe unbelievable. And then you genuinely give them a good time. Once they're there, of course. Alright, so about that mermaid. Well, it turns out it was the top half of a dried up monkey. That's right. And it was carefully stitched onto the back half of a fish. And it was completely 100% fake. And this is a true story. And here's the wildest part. Even after people figured that out, they kept showing up anyway. It's like they loved getting fooled. And maybe they were showing up just to argue with each other about whether or not it was actually real. It's like people today debating about whether something is real on a viral video. That's what it was like. And Barnum had turned basically a fake monkey fish thing into one of the most talked about attractions in America. That's right. And that exhibit, well, that was just the beginning, because his very next big attraction, well, it wasn't a hoax at all. It was actually very real and genuine, a once-in-a-generation talent. Let's head into part 3. Alright, so right after the mermaid, Barnum brought on a 4-year-old boy named Charles Stratton. And Barnum actually displayed him publicly as an 11-year-old boy, which he wasn't. And he gave him a stage name, General Tom Thumb. You might have heard about this story. See, Stratton had a rare condition that meant he stayed extremely small his entire life. And Barnum actually trained him to become an absolutely dazzling performer. I mean, Tom Thumb could sing, and he could dance, and he could tell jokes, and he even did pretty incredible, spot-on impressions of famous historical figures like the ancient Hercules or the French Emperor Napoleon. And Tom Thumb wasn't just a local hit. In fact, in 1844, Barnum took him on a tour across Europe. And that tiny performer, he charmed his way straight into royal palaces. I mean, he even performed for Queen Victoria of England herself, who was completely charmed by him. That single visit actually opened up the door to meeting royalty everywhere across the entire continent, including the Tsar of Russia. And by 1846, thanks to Tom Thumb and other people that Barnum had hired, Barnum's museum was drawing an incredible 400,000 visitors a year. And just to give you some perspective, the estimated population of New York City at the time was something like 515,000. So that gives you an understanding of the scale of how popular Barnum's museum actually was. But none of that, not even the mermaid, not even Tom Thumb, not the balloon rides, was actually Barnum's biggest gamble. That one's still coming. Now remember that bet that I mentioned from the very beginning of the episode? Well, that one involving the voice he never heard? It's time to go back to it. Let's head into part 4. Alright, now while Barnum was touring Europe with Tom Thumb, he kept hearing about one particular singer who was causing an absolute sensation across the continent. It was a Swedish opera performer named Jenny Lind, who had the nickname the Swedish Nightingale. And here's the wild part. Barnum, by his own admission, he wasn't even much of a music guy. I mean, he didn't really have a good year for knowing who's a good singer and who's not. And yet, just on a whim, he offered her an eye-watering deal, $1,000 a night for 150 nights, with all her expenses paid, to come to perform in America. I mean, it's an enormous amount of money for a live performance in 1850, and Lynn obviously agreed. But there was a major condition that she asked for. She wanted her fee paid up front, entirely, before a single ticket was even sold. So Barnum had to scramble, I mean, 150 nights at $1,000 a night in 1850, that's $150,000. I mean, that is a lot of money today, but back then it was an absolute fortune. So Barnum had to absolutely scramble. He borrowed heavily against his own mansion, his own house. He borrowed against his museum, and he was still short on cash. So he convinced a Philadelphia minister that Jenny Lind's performance are going to change the world. They're going to be wonderful, and they're going to be wholesome influence on American culture. And that minister personally loaned him the last $6,000 he needed to close the deal. And think about the position that Barnum was in. I mean, he had bet his house, his livelihood, his reputation, his museum on a singer that most Americans had never heard of, and based on a voice that he had personally never heard. So did it work? Well, before we get into that, we need to set the scene. Lind's ship finally arrives in New York in September of 1850, and nearly 40,000 people show up just to greet her at the docks, and another 20,000 crowded her hotel. And her very first concert was a massive success. Barnum reportedly, on that night alone, had made back 4 times what he'd invested, just on opening night. And the crowds were so enthusiastic, the newspaper coined a brand new term just to describe it, Lind-mania. And by the time the tour wrapped up, Jenny Lind had performed 93 concerts and earned an estimated $350,000. I mean, Barnum himself walked away with an estimated $500,000, which adjusted for inflation today is somewhere around $20 million, which is a lot of money. I mean, at that point, that put him on the map. The man had worked his entire life and it had paid off. He bet on everything, on a sound he never heard. Now, here's a fun little myth to clear up before we move forward. And that myth is pretty interesting. Let's head into part 5. Alright, you probably heard the phrase, there's a sucker born every minute. And you probably heard it credited to P.T. Barnum. In fact, that's what the internet says. And here's a twist. There's actually no solid evidence he ever said that at all. And historians, they've done the work. They've dug through transcripts, letters, books, his interviews. Nothing. What he actually said was something a little kinder and honestly a lot more accurate to how he saw his own audience. And it's important to include this in here because it's a detail that I think it's going to give a lot of personality to P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum actually said, people like to be humbugged. You see, in his mind, his customers weren't suckers being tricked. They were willing participants having fun with him. They were in on the joke. He even called himself proudly the Prince of Humbugs. So Barnum built an entire career convincing people that fake mermaids and impossibly small generals were worth their money. And it worked because everyone kind of knew what they were signing up for. But not everything in Barnum's story was smooth sailing. In fact, his beloved museum was about to face something that no amount of clever marketing could fix. Let's head into part 6. So during the Civil War, Barnum had made some pretty bold political commentary, similar to what he did in his newspaper early on in his career. And he did that through his museum's exhibits. And that public display of his own politics, well, apparently made him a bit of a target. Because in 1864, someone actually attempted to set fire to his museum on purpose. And that attempt, luckily, didn't succeed. But the following year, he wasn't so lucky because on July 13, 1865, Barnum's museum really did burn to the ground from a fire whose cause was actually never discovered. And Barnum, being Barnum, he didn't just give up. He rebuilt his museum at a brand new location in New York City. And at this point you're thinking, all is well. The man has gotten back on his feet. But hold on, because in March of 1868, that second museum burned down as well. At that point, Barnum decided enough was enough. And he stepped away from the museum business entirely. And you can't blame the man. I mean, his first museum, his beloved attraction, burns down to the ground, and then he rebuilds, and then a second one burns down to the ground. You can't blame the guy if he just wants to quit. So he steps away from the museum business entirely. Now, if this were most people's stories, that might be the end of it. A man in his late 50s, watching 2 museums burn to the ground, deciding to retire. Cool. Nobody's blaming him. But P.T. Barnum was not most people. And he did something most of us could only dream of. Let's head into the final part of the story. At an age when a lot of people are thinking about slowing down, Barnum actually sped up. He did the exact opposite because at age 60, he launches an entirely new venture, a traveling circus. It became the very first circus in America to use 3 rings at once, and eventually, after teaming up with a partner named James Bailey, it became known as Barnum and Bailey's, the greatest show on earth. The circus's biggest attraction was an enormous African elephant named Jumbo. And we're going to get to that in a second because Jumbo was pretty important. Barnum purchased Jumbo from the London Zoo in 1882, and that sale caused a bit of an uproar in Britain because Jumbo, in Britain, had been a beloved national treasure. But in America, it sparked something people started calling Jumbo Mania. And Jumbo was so famous that the word Jumbo itself entered the English language as another way of saying giant. And at the very next year, in 1883, Jumbo would do something amazing, because in the next year, there were rumors that the New York City New Bridge might not be so safe, and it caused a panic. Nobody would use it. So in a moment of absolute bravery, Barnum made a pretty wild offer to the government. Let me march my circus animals across the bridge as a publicity stunt. And I'm going to help prove once and for all that that bridge is actually strong enough to carry cars and people. And on the night of May 17, 1884, Barnum wakes up from a short nap. He puts on his boots, his coat, and his hat, and he goes on to lead 21 elephants and 17 camels across the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, can you imagine that image of just a stampede of animals walking across the bridge? And in fact, Jumbo himself was right there in the parade. And some of those elephants weighed over 10,000 pounds each. So if that bridge had any hidden weaknesses at all, that thing was going down. And that walk would have been the moment to find out. And miraculously, it held completely, and everyone was safe. And Barnum, he just handed himself one of the greatest publicity stunts in American history, while also proving to an entire city that their new bridge was actually safe. So let's pull this whole story together. We met a boy in Connecticut who already was hustling before he was a teenager. We watched him turn a fake monkey stitched to a fish into a national sensation. We saw him bet his entire fortune on a singer's voice he had never once heard and win. We watched 2 of his museums burn to the ground, only for him to reinvent himself at age 60 with an entirely new circus empire. And we watched him march a parade of elephants across one of the most famous bridges in the world, just to prove a point. And his legacy is still everywhere today, and his story inspired the hit movie which you may have seen called The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman. So here's a fun thought to leave you with. Barnum built an entire career on an idea that people love being amazed, even when a part of them suspects that it might not all be real. Maybe that's the real secret behind any great story. So what do you have in your own life that can maybe fool, but also amaze and inspire other people? Thank you so much for joining me on this adventure in history. And if you're watching on YouTube, would you click on that like button, maybe leave a comment with your favorite part, and maybe consider subscribing if these are stories that you enjoy. It'll mean the world to me. I'll catch you next time.